On the southern coast of Turkey, there's a harbour that's been abandoned for thousands of years. Barely anyone knows about it. The excavations and the museum here are still fairly new. This ancient site is called Andriake, and it's one of the most complete Roman-era ports anywhere in the Mediterranean. The moment you step in, you're hit with a real sense of abandonment. The sea has pulled back, the harbour has closed off, and the city has slowly been swallowed by the ground over the years. This isn't your average ruins visit. This is stepping into a lost world. Along the long Lycian coastline, stretching from Antalya to Fethi, finding a sheltered harbour was never easy. There were plenty of rocky coves, but ships needed something else entirely: fresh water. Even small boats couldn't set off on long voyages without taking some on board. That's exactly why a harbour that offered both shelter and access to fresh water was worth its weight in gold in the ancient world. And Andriake was exactly that kind of place, both a refuge and a lifeline. We know just how old and how busy maritime trade was along this coast because two of the world's oldest known shipwrecks were found right here. One off Gelidonia Point, the other a little further along at Uluburun, both dating back to the Bronze Age, thousands of years ago. Both are on display today at the Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology. These wrecks tell us this stretch of Lycian coastline has been a busy trade route since the very beginning. Building a harbour that offered both water and protection along a route like that wasn't just luck, it was a serious advantage. In fact, past Andriake, sheltered coves continue all along central Lycia, but the next major harbour with a fresh water source doesn't appear until much further on, at Patara. Welcome to the channel. In the last episode, we explored the ancient cities around Kekova, the sunken cities. Today we're somewhere that feels similar, but has a very different story. If you're into these lesser-known ancient cities and the stories behind them, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment for more of this series. Now let's get back to Andriake. Andriake, as it turns out, was never an independent city in its own right. It was the harbour of Myra, the larger city about 5 kilometers inland that we covered in an earlier episode. Myra was significant on its own. Ancient sources even call it a metropolis, a major hub. But Myra's wealth, its power, its gateway to the wider world, all of it ran through here, through Andriake. If you ask where a city actually breathes from, the answer is its harbour. And Myra breathed through this one for centuries. The earliest archaeological traces here go back to the 3rd century BCE. But a lot of researchers think the harbour was actually in use much earlier, during the classical period. That's because Myra itself was already a significant city by the 5th century BCE. If a city was growing wealthy that early, its harbour was probably operating that early too. So there's a story here that reaches back further than the evidence we currently have. A story that hasn't been fully uncovered yet. We know that in 197 BCE, the Syrian king Antiochus III arrived here with his fleet. Even that alone tells you Andriake was important enough at the time to be a stop for major naval powers. The structures you come across walking through here today are really just the visible surface of a much deeper, multi-layered history. There's a whole life buried underground, built up over centuries, patiently waiting to be excavated. To really understand the story of a harbour city, you can't just look at one building. You have to look at the whole fabric of it. And that's exactly where Andriake stands out. Here, almost everything tied to the harbour, and the harbour itself has survived nearly intact. Narrow streets, a road running along the waterfront, shops, warehouses, bathhouses, churches, all of it appears at once. That's why walking through Andriake doesn't feel like visiting a single building. It feels like stepping into an entire day, an entire life. A ship Pulling into the harbour at dawn, merchants waiting on the docks, goods being sold in the shops. All of that was once here. And that's really the most striking part. This harbour city isn't hiding from you. It's surfaced, it's standing, it's looking right back at you. But most of its stories still aren't fully understood. And that's what makes a place feel both familiar and mysterious at the same time. There are dozens more places like this, forgotten and out of the way, still waiting for you. Subscribing to this channel and liking this video is the easiest way to see them before the crowds do. Now make your way toward the most impressive structure in this harbour. From a distance, it might throw you off. The building in front of you looks like it was built almost yesterday, with a roof and walls barely worn at all. A lot of visitors ask the same question the moment they see it. What's a building this modern-looking doing in the middle of an ancient city? But there's nothing modern about it. This is a massive granary, built in the 2nd century CE, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. It's one of 2 large grain storehouses in the Lycian region, and the only one of the 2 still standing almost completely intact, all the way up to its roof. And that's where the mystery kicks in. A building surviving this well isn't just a matter of luck. This structure may be tied directly to a personal visit from an emperor. The inscriptions on the reliefs date its construction to the exact period Hadrian toured the region. An emperor doesn't just casually stop by some small harbour town. If he did, it meant something important was happening there. And that important thing was grain, the single most valuable commodity of the era. Rome was home to around 1 million people at the time, and feeding that population required an enormous supply network. Grain was gathered from across Anatolia, from North Africa, from every corner of the empire, and shipped back to Rome. Andriake was a key node in that massive trade network. The storage area here covers more than 2,000 square meters, making it one of the largest structures of its kind in the region. What that means is simple. This wasn't just a harbour. It was a centre directly wired into the economic backbone of an entire empire. Today, that same granary has been turned into a museum. It now serves as the Museum of Lycian Civilizations. Just east of the granary stands the harbour's agora. It's a wide-open square, roughly 60 by 40 metres, with a large cistern carved into the ground at its centre and rows of shops lining the sides. Inside these shops, dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, archaeologists found something unexpected: dense layers of shellfish waste. That waste comes from a sea snail called murex. Back then, the purple dye extracted from these shells wasn't just a colouring agent. It was, quite literally, a fortune. That colour was known as royal purple, because only kings and nobles were allowed to wear cloth dyed in it. Producing it was both labour-intensive and expensive. It took thousands of crushed shells just to extract a few drops of dye. The waste layers found at Andriake, in some places, reach 2 to 3 metres deep. That alone tells you there was massive-scale production happening here, and a massive revenue stream tied to it. Sometimes a city's wealth doesn't come from its grand temples. It comes from a tiny seashell. And Andriake is one of the most striking proofs of that. This industry likely gave the city more than just prosperity. It probably gave it a form of financial independence, too. Extracting an extremely high-value product from a limited raw material is a serious advantage for any port economy. Being locked into Rome's massive supply chain gave the city power on one hand, but owning a valuable commodity of its own boosted its economic autonomy on the other. Put those two things together, and it becomes clear Andriake wasn't just a transit point. It was an economic power centre in its own right. The grain storehouse and the purple dye workshops beneath this city are actually a reminder of something very modern. An economy shouldn't rely on a single source of income to stay standing. Andriake was plugged into the agricultural supply chain, but it was also producing its own luxury export. Even 2,000 years ago, it seems, people understood that a diversified economy is a more resilient one. And underneath the agora sits yet another engineering marvel, a massive cistern. Before restoration, anyone wanting to get inside had to crawl through the rocks and could only make it about halfway down. Today, the entire structure is visible, and its scale is genuinely startling. This wasn't just built to solve the city's water shortage. Its real purpose was supplying fresh water to ships docking at the harbour. Rainwater collected in this cistern was pulled up by bucket from the wellheads above and carried straight to the ships. A harbour this wealthy, this busy, and it's barely known today. Isn't that a little strange? A harbour city is never just made of stone. The real story lives in the people who once walked between those stones. You can feel that clearly walking through Andriake, because every structure you come across here was once part of someone's everyday life. A merchant, a sailor, a priest, a watchman, all of them walked these narrow streets, shopped in these stores, prayed in this harbour. Religious life here was especially rich. Considering the needs of the travellers and traders who used this port, 6 churches and 1 synagogue were built here. Most of these churches, dated from the 5th to the 12th century, follow a 3-aisled, wide basilica layout. St. Paul, one of the founding figures of Christianity, is known to have passed through here too, which makes Andriake especially significant for the history of early Christianity. Harbour cities back then functioned a lot like major airports do today. New ideas, new beliefs arrived here first, then spread inland from there. In the apse of one of the churches, the semicircular area where clergy would sit, you can still see the original stone seating rows. But the real surprise came from a more recent excavation. Right at the western corner of the Granary, archaeologists uncovered a structure belonging to a community that had never once been mentioned in any ancient source or inscription: a synagogue. The first ever found on Turkey's Mediterranean coast, it brought a genuinely hidden piece of history into the light. The inscriptions on it contained a word never before seen in the region: the name Israel. This wasn't just a religious building. It was the first concrete evidence of a community that had stayed silent in these lands for centuries. Think about it. Right in the most desirable corner of the harbour, during a period when Christianity was at its most dominant, there's a synagogue standing. It might seem surprising at first, but it actually makes perfect sense. This was a trading city. In a place where commerce thrives and money flows, different communities could live side by side in peace. Nobody had to erase anybody else. Everyone could mind their own business and stand together for centuries. Looking at today's world, the lesson that this small harbour city offers doesn't feel outdated at all. The traces of everyday life at Andriake aren't limited to religious buildings. You can find them in far more ordinary places too. There are 2 bathhouses standing side by side in the city. There are also striking traces of the harbour's legal and commercial life. One of the inscriptions on the honorary monuments contains a regulation concerning fishing net sellers. It seems some sellers were cheating their customers or selling low-quality materials, and a penalty was put in place as a result. Punishments in the ancient world were mostly financial, but there was a harsher one too: exile. Being torn away from your own city, from your own life, was sometimes considered a punishment even heavier than death. This small inscription shows just how intertwined justice, trust, and trade already were, even thousands of years ago. Andriake's importance wasn't just local either. An inscription found here contains the customs law of the Lycian League, put up during the 1st century under Emperor Nero. This wasn't some minor local regulation. It was a document governing trade across the entire region. According to the sources, the Lycian League's navy even anchored in this harbour. In other words, this wasn't just Myra's port. It was one of the administrative and economic centres of an entire region. Another space uncovered during excavations captures that same human atmosphere perfectly. A harbour tavern. Cups, cooking pots, food and drink vessels, all found together, side by side. Put them together in your mind and the scene becomes vivid. A tired sailor, after a long voyage, sitting down here, eating a hot meal, maybe having a cup of wine. The sounds and smells of that moment are long gone, but the vessels themselves still tell you it happened. Walking these streets today, none of that crowd, none of those voices remain. Just remains. Just stone. But if you stop and really listen, you might feel like something is still whispering inside that silence. If a society once managed to build a place where people of different faiths could live side by side in peace, why do we find that so hard today? Every harbour eventually meets its end. For Andriake, that end didn't come suddenly. It came slowly. Toward the 7th and 8th centuries, a combination of earthquake damage and accumulating coastal silt gradually made the harbour shallower. Ships could no longer dock. Trade volume dropped, then stopped altogether. A place that was once one of the busiest harbours in the Mediterranean turned, step by step, into a marsh. It was, in many ways, a classic story of economic collapse. But strangely enough, that collapse ended up protecting Andriake, rather than destroying it. Because no one ever built a new city on top of it. No one stripped its stones to use in other buildings. Time just left it exactly as it was. That's why, when you visit Andriake today, you're seeing something rare. A pure, undisturbed harbour city. Most ancient harbours disappeared beneath the newer cities built over them, the same way nearby Myra ended up almost entirely buried under river silt. Andriake had a different fate. Its harbour filled in, it lost its function, but the city itself survived, largely undisturbed, as remains reaching all the way into the present. Sometimes, a city's collapse turns out to be its greatest protector. Currency stopped flowing, merchants moved on to other harbours. But that's exactly why the stones they left behind stayed untouched by anyone else. The reason this place still matters today isn't just because the stones are beautiful. Andriake shows you how, even 2,000 years ago, an economy needed to be diversified, how a society could live alongside different beliefs, and how limited resources could still be tied into a much larger monetary system. From the grain trade to the purple dye, from the customs law to the water management system. Everything here carries the mark of smart investment. Even today's urban planners still point to the functional zoning here, the clear separation between shipyards, storage areas, the market, and social spaces, as a model example. All of these remains come together today under one roof, inside the Museum of Lycian Civilizations. The museum was built right inside that old granary, meaning the very building housing these artifacts is itself part of the history on display. Inside you'll find countless valuable artifacts belonging to the civilizations that once ruled over ancient Lycian lands. The collection isn't limited to Andriake either. It's enriched with pieces gathered from cities across the region, each one carrying its own story, its own slice of a particular era. Lycian civilization is considered one of the most significant ancient civilizations of Western Anatolia. And here, in this single place that's both a harbour and a museum, you can see the traces of that ancient civilization all at once. Maybe the most special thing about this museum is this. It displays its artifacts on the very ground they were found, within their own history, not shipped off to another city, not sitting in some other display case. Everything stands exactly where it once stood. Looking at a relief, an inscription, a piece of glass. You're not just looking at an object. You're looking at whatever hands it passed through thousands of years ago. It's an experience most museums in the world simply can't offer, because these artifacts have never once left the ground they were born from. Visiting Andriake is really like standing at the edge of a lost world. The sea has pulled back, the people are gone, the voices have gone quiet. But it's exactly that abandonment, that lost atmosphere, that keeps pulling people back here. Wandering through it, you find yourself standing at the threshold of a life that once existed and was then forgotten for centuries. The silence you feel walking through these ruins isn't empty at all. It carries the stories of thousands of people inside it. A merchant's footsteps, a priest's prayer, a sailor's laugh. None of it can be heard anymore. But all of it was once here, and that trace still lingers among the stones. Watching this video, maybe you've wondered how many forgotten harbours, how many quietly waiting cities like this exist scattered across the world. That's exactly what this channel is here for, sharing places the crowds haven't found yet, places that still carry stories thousands of years old. If you don't want to miss places like this, subscribing and liking this video is the easiest way to see them first. Andriake was once full of ships carried in on the waves. Today, there's only the wind and a silence drifting between the stones. But maybe a place's real power doesn't come from the crowds. Maybe it comes from exactly this, the quiet.